My name is Detective Robert Johnson, and I've been serving at Chicago Metropolitan Police Department for 19 years. In nearly 2 decades of police work, I've encountered every kind of criminal imaginable: gang members, drug dealers, murderers, and thieves. But sometimes you meet someone whose story shakes you to your very core, someone who makes you question the thin line between justice and revenge, between love and obsession. This is the story that Mark Collins told me 4 months ago, sitting in his maximum security prison cell, where he's serving multiple life sentences for 5 counts of first-degree murder. When Mark first shared his story with me, I expected to hear the typical excuses and justifications that criminals use to rationalize their actions. Instead, I heard the heartbreaking confession of a father whose love for his son had transformed him into something monstrous. Mark Collins was 41 years old when he committed the crimes that would destroy not just 5 families, but his own as well. He was a security guard at First National Bank in downtown Chicago, a job he had held for 8 years. Mark wasn't wealthy, wasn't particularly ambitious, and wasn't someone you would notice in a crowd. But he was a devoted father to his 12-year-old son Ethan, and that devotion would ultimately become both his greatest strength and his most devastating weakness. Mark told me about his life before everything changed, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. He had been a single father since Ethan was 3 years old, when his wife Jennifer died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. The loss had devastated Mark, but he had forced himself to keep going for Ethan's sake. "Detective Johnson," Mark said, his hands trembling as he spoke, "Ethan was everything to me. After Jennifer died, that boy became my entire world. Every decision I made, every breath I took, was for him. I worked double shifts at the bank so I could afford to send him to Riverside Academy, one of the best private schools in Chicago. Riverside Academy was indeed one of Chicago's most prestigious private schools, catering primarily to the children of wealthy families. Mark's salary as a security guard barely covered the tuition, but he was determined to give Ethan the best education possible. He believed that education was the key to giving his son opportunities that Mark himself had never had. Mark would wake up at 4 a.m. every morning to prepare Ethan's lunch, help him with his homework from the night before, and drive him to school before heading to his own job at the bank. In the evenings, he would pick Ethan up from after-school activities, help him with more homework, and spend time talking about Ethan's day, his dreams, and his plans for the future. Ethan was brilliant, Mark told me, his eyes lighting up even in the dim prison cell. Not just book smart, though he was that too. He was kind, funny, curious about everything. He wanted to be a veterinarian because he loved animals. He used to volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends, and he had this way with scared, hurt animals that was just magical. For 9 years, Mark and Ethan had built a life together that, while not wealthy, was rich in love and stability. Mark had never remarried, dedicating himself completely to raising his son. He coached Ethan's little league team, attended every school concert and play, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. Ethan thrived at Riverside Academy academically, but Mark began to notice that his son seemed increasingly isolated socially. When Mark asked about friends, Ethan would become evasive, saying that he was focused on his studies and didn't have time for social activities. "I should have paid more attention," Mark said, his voice filled with self-recrimination. "I should have realized that something was wrong." But Ethan was always so good at hiding his problems, so determined not to worry me. He knew how hard I worked to keep him at that school, and he didn't want to complain. The truth was that Ethan had become the target of a group of wealthy bullies at Riverside Academy. These weren't typical schoolyard bullies. They were the children of powerful families who had grown up believing that their money and connections made them untouchable. The ringleader was Tyler Blackwood, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels. Tyler's main accomplices were Connor Morrison, whose mother was a prominent judge, and Brandon Hartley, whose father was one of Chicago's most successful real estate developers. These boys had targeted Ethan for several reasons. First, he was one of the few scholarship students at the school. making him an outsider in their elite social circle. Second, Ethan consistently outperformed them academically, which threatened their sense of superiority. Finally, and perhaps most cruelly, they resented the fact that despite his lower economic status, Ethan was genuinely well-liked by teachers and other students who appreciated his kindness and intelligence. The bullying had started small, name-calling, exclusion from social groups, accidentally knocking Ethan's books out of his hands. But over the months, it had escalated to more serious harassment. They would steal his lunch money, vandalize his locker, and spread rumors about him and his father. Mark remained unaware of the extent of the bullying because Ethan was protecting him. The boy understood how much his father sacrificed to keep him at Riverside Academy, and he was determined not to give Mark any reason to pull him out of the school. "If I had known what those monsters were doing to my son," Mark said, his voice hardening, "I would have handled it properly. I would have gone to the school, talked to the parents, worked through the system. But Ethan never told me how bad it had gotten." The situation reached a breaking point on a cold February morning. Tyler, Connor, and Brandon had cornered Ethan in the school gymnasium after classes had ended for the day. Most students had gone home, and the few remaining were in other parts of the building. What happened next was captured partially on the gymnasium security camera, footage that would later become crucial evidence in the criminal cases that followed. The boys began by pushing Ethan around, taunting him about his father's job and their family's lack of money. "Look at little scholarship boy," Tyler had sneered. "Daddy works security at a bank. What does that pay? Like $30,000 a year. My father spends more than that on wine." Ethan tried to walk away, but the boys blocked his path. When Ethan attempted to push past them, Tyler shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. "Where are you going, poor boy?" Connor taunted. "We are just trying to have a conversation with you." The situation escalated quickly from verbal abuse to physical violence. The boys began taking turns pushing Ethan, each shove harder than the last. When Ethan fell to the ground, they began kicking him, first in the legs and stomach, then increasingly targeting his head and face. The security camera footage, which Mark would later watch during the investigation, showed the attack lasting for nearly 8 minutes. 8 minutes of 3 teenagers systematically beating a smaller, weaker child who was trying desperately to protect himself. The attack only stopped when Mr. Peterson, the school janitor, entered the gymnasium and found Ethan unconscious on the floor, blood pooling around his head. Tyler, Connor, and Brandon were standing over him, their knuckles bloody, breathing heavily from their exertion. Mark received the phone call at work. The school nurse, Mrs. Williams, called to tell him that Ethan had been injured and was being taken to Chicago Memorial Hospital by ambulance. "Mr. Collins," Mrs. Williams had said, her voice shaking, "you need to get to the hospital immediately. Ethan has been seriously hurt." Mark didn't remember driving to the hospital. He didn't remember parking his car or running through the emergency room doors. His first clear memory was of Dr. Sarah Martinez, the attending physician, explaining Ethan's condition. "Mr. Collins, your son has suffered severe traumatic brain injury," Dr. Martinez said gently. "He has multiple skull fractures, significant brain swelling, and internal bleeding. We've induced a medical coma to help his brain heal. But I need to be honest with you, the next 72 hours are critical." Mark stared at Dr. Martinez, unable to process what she was telling him. His healthy, vibrant son was fighting for his life because of an attack at school. Who did this to him? Mark asked, his voice barely audible. Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with the police officer who had been waiting to speak with Mark. Detective Lisa Rodriguez introduced herself and explained what they knew about the attack. "Mr. Collins, your son was assaulted by 3 other students at his school. We have security footage of the incident, and there were witnesses. The 3 boys involved are Tyler Blackwood, Connor Morrison, and Brandon Hartley." Mark knew those names. Ethan had mentioned them before, though never in the context of bullying. Mark had always assumed they were just classmates. What happens to them now? Mark asked. Detective Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. Because they're all minors, they'll be processed through the juvenile system. Given their ages and the fact that they have no prior criminal records, they'll likely receive probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. Probation. Mark's voice rose. My son is in a coma, and they get probation. I understand your frustration, Mr. Collins, but the juvenile justice system is designed to rehabilitate rather than punish. These boys will face consequences for their actions. But Mark soon learned that even those minimal consequences would be unlikely. Within hours of the boy's arrest, teams of expensive lawyers had descended on the police station. Tyler's father hired one of Chicago's most prominent defense attorneys. Connor's mother used her judicial connections to ensure the case would be handled appropriately. Brandon's father began making calls to influential friends throughout the city. The story that emerged from their legal teams was very different from what the security footage showed. According to their version of events, Ethan had started the fight by attacking Tyler. The other boys had only defended themselves, and Ethan's injuries were the result of him falling and hitting his head. During the altercation, the security footage clearly contradicted this story, but the lawyers argued that the camera angle was misleading and that the audio was too poor to determine what had actually been said during the confrontation. Mark sat by Ethan's bedside for 6 days, holding his son's hand and talking to him even though the doctors said he might not be able to hear. On the 7th day, Ethan opened his eyes. Dad. Ethan's voice was weak and confused. I'm here, buddy, Mark said, tears streaming down his face. Daddy's right here. But Ethan wasn't the same boy who had left for school a week earlier. The brain injury had affected his memory, his coordination, and his personality. Simple tasks like speaking clearly or walking without assistance had become monumental challenges. Over the following weeks, as Ethan slowly began to recover, he told Mark about the months of bullying he had endured. He described the daily humiliation, the fear he had felt walking through the school halls, and his desperate attempts to avoid his tormentors. Dad, I'm sorry, Ethan said one afternoon, his speech still slurred from the brain injury. I should have told you what they were doing to me. You have nothing to apologize for, Mark replied, holding his son's hand. Nothing that happened to you was your fault. But privately, Mark was consumed with rage. His son had been systematically tortured by these boys for months, and then nearly killed, and they were going to walk away with minimal consequences because their parents had money and influence. The juvenile court proceedings were a farce. Tyler, Connor, and Brandon appeared in court wearing expensive suits, accompanied by their parents and lawyers. They expressed regret for their actions and claimed they had learned valuable lessons about the consequences of violence. Tyler's father spoke about his son's promising future, his acceptance to elite universities, and his potential contributions to society. Connor's mother emphasized her son's volunteer work with local charities and his exemplary academic record. Brandon's father described his son as a fundamentally good kid who had made a single mistake. The judge, who was a longtime friend of several of the families involved, sentenced each boy to 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management counseling. Mark sat in the courtroom, watching these people describe his son's attackers as victims of circumstances, and felt something break inside him. The system that was supposed to protect children had failed his son completely. After the sentencing, Tyler's father approached Mark in the courthouse hallway. Mr. Collins, Richard Blackwood said, extending his hand. I want you to know how sorry we are about what happened to Ethan. Boys will be boys. You know, but sometimes these things get out of hand. Mark stared at Blackwood's outstretched hand but didn't take it. My son is permanently brain damaged because your son and his friends beat him nearly to death. Mark said quietly, and you call it boys being boys? Blackwood's expression hardened. Look, Collins, I understand you're upset, but my son is going to Harvard in the fall. This incident isn't going to ruin his future over some playground fight. Playground fight? Mark's voice was dangerously quiet. Is that what you call it? I call it kids being kids. If your son had fought back instead of just lying there and taking it, maybe he wouldn't have gotten hurt so badly. Those words would haunt Mark for months to come. The implication that Ethan was somehow responsible for his own victimization, that he should have fought back against 3 larger boys, that his son was weak for not defending himself. It was more than Mark could bear. That night, Mark sat in Ethan's hospital room and made a decision that would change everything. The legal system had failed his son. The school had failed his son. Society had failed his son. But Mark wouldn't fail him. Mark began researching the 3 families extensively. He learned about their businesses, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He studied their homes, their schedules, their relationships. He began to formulate a plan that would give these people a taste of the pain and fear that his son had experienced. "Detective Johnson," Mark said to me, his voice taking on a cold, determined tone that sent chills down my spine. I wasn't going to let them destroy my son's life and then walk away as if nothing had happened. They wanted to play games with a working man's family? I was going to show them exactly what kind of game I could play. Mark's transformation from devoted father to calculating predator had begun. The man who had spent 12 years nurturing and protecting his son was about to become something far darker, driven by love that had curdled into hatred and a thirst for revenge that would consume everything in its path. The 3 families who thought their money and influence had protected them from consequences were about to learn that some fathers will go to any lengths to defend their children, even if it means destroying themselves in the process. Mark's first target was Richard Blackwood, Tyler's father and the owner of Blackwood Hotels. Mark had spent weeks studying the man's routine, learning that Blackwood worked late most evenings at his downtown office and often didn't return home until after midnight. Mark told me that he felt no emotion as he prepared for what he was about to do. The rage that had initially consumed him had crystallized into something colder and more dangerous, a methodical determination to make these people suffer the way his son had suffered. "Detective Johnson," Mark said, his voice eerily calm, "I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I had a job to do, and I was going to do it right." On a Thursday night in May, 3 months after Ethan's attack, Mark broke into the Blackwood family's mansion in Lincoln Park. He knew from his surveillance that Richard wouldn't be home until late, and that Tyler was at a friend's house for the evening. Only Richard's wife, Catherine, and their 10-year-old daughter, Emma, were in the house. Mark entered through a basement window that he had noticed was often left unlocked. He made his way upstairs to the main floor, carrying a gasoline can and wearing a ski mask to conceal his identity. Catherine Blackwood was in the living room, reading a book and waiting for her husband to come home. When she saw Mark enter the room, she opened her mouth to scream, but Mark quickly covered her mouth with his hand. "If you scream, I'll kill your daughter," Mark whispered. "Do you understand me?" Catherine nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "Where is your daughter?" Mark asked. "Upstairs. In her room. Doing homework," Catherine stammered. Mark forced Catherine upstairs at gunpoint, where they found Emma at her desk, working on a school project. The little girl looked up when they entered, her face immediately showing confusion and fear at seeing her mother with a masked stranger. "Mommy," Emma said in a small voice. "It's okay, sweetheart," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Just do exactly what the man says, and everything will be fine." Mark forced both mother and daughter into Emma's bedroom closet, tying their hands and feet with rope he had brought for this purpose. He gagged them to prevent them from crying out, but made sure they could breathe properly. "I want you to think about my son," Mark said to Catherine as he secured the ropes. "His name is Ethan Collins. Your son and his friends beat him so badly that he nearly died. While you sit in this closet, wondering if you're going to live or die, I want you to imagine how terrified my 12-year-old boy was while your son was kicking him in the head." Mark then systematically poured gasoline throughout the mansion, on the floors, the furniture, the curtains. He was methodical and thorough, ensuring that the fire would spread quickly and completely. Before leaving, Mark returned to the closet where Catherine and Emma were tied up. "I'm going to start the fire now," he said calmly. "Your husband should be home in about 2 hours. That should give you just enough time to get out if you work together and don't panic. But you're going to have to fight for your lives, just like my son had to fight for his. Mark lit the fire in the living room and left through the same basement window he had used to enter. He drove to a position several blocks away where he could watch the house burn. Catherine and Emma managed to free themselves from their bonds after nearly an hour of desperate struggling. By the time they escaped the burning house, the mansion was completely engulfed in flames. They survived, but the family lost everything: their home, their possessions, and their sense of security. Richard Blackwood arrived home to find fire trucks and ambulances surrounding the smoking remains of his house. His wife and daughter were being treated for smoke inhalation, but they were alive. The fire was quickly ruled as arson, but there were no witnesses and no physical evidence that could identify the perpetrator. The police investigated thoroughly, but Mark had been careful not to leave any traces of his presence. The look on Blackwood's face when he saw his house burning. Mark told me, that was the first time I felt anything close to satisfaction since Ethan's attack. He was experiencing just a fraction of the helplessness and fear that I had felt watching my son fight for his life. But Mark wasn't finished with the Blackwood family. 2 weeks later, Tyler Blackwood was walking home from a friend's house when he was approached by a man in a dark hoodie. The man, Mark, asked Tyler for directions, and when the teenager stopped to help, Mark hit him with a baseball bat. Tyler suffered a broken arm, several broken ribs, and a concussion. He spent 4 days in the hospital, experiencing the same fear and pain that Ethan had endured. When Tyler was released from the hospital, Mark was waiting for him in the parking garage. Tyler Blackwood, Mark said, approaching the teenager who was still weak from his injuries. Tyler looked up, confused and frightened. "Do I know you?" "I'm Ethan Collins's father," Mark said quietly. "You remember Ethan, don't you? The boy you and your friends beat nearly to death." Tyler's face went white with recognition and terror. "Now you know how it feels," Mark said. "But my son's injuries were much worse than yours, so we are not even close to being even yet." Mark's second target was Judge Patricia Morrison, Connor's mother. Mark knew that attacking a sitting judge would bring intense police scrutiny, so he planned his revenge against the Morrison family more carefully. Mark discovered that Judge Morrison had been having an affair with a prominent attorney for over 2 years. Using surveillance equipment he had purchased with his savings, Mark gathered photographic evidence of the affair and sent copies to Judge Morrison's husband, the local newspaper, and the Judicial Ethics Board. The scandal destroyed Judge Morrison's career and her marriage. She was forced to resign from the bench and faced the possibility of criminal charges for judicial misconduct related to cases involving her lover. But Mark wasn't satisfied with just destroying Patricia Morrison's career. He wanted her to experience the same physical fear that his son had felt. Connor Morrison was attacked 3 weeks later while jogging in Lincoln Park. Mark approached him wearing a ski mask and attacked him with a metal pipe, breaking Connor's leg in 2 places and fracturing his skull. Connor spent 6 weeks in the hospital and required multiple surgeries to repair the damage to his leg. Like Tyler, he would live with permanent reminders of what had been done to him. Mark's final target was the Hartley family. Brandon's father, Thomas Hartley, was a real estate developer who had built his fortune through a combination of legitimate business deals and questionable practices that skirted the edge of legality. Mark spent months investigating Hartley's business dealings, eventually uncovering evidence of tax evasion, bribery of city officials, and fraudulent insurance claims. Mark compiled this evidence into a comprehensive dossier and sent copies to the IRS, the FBI, and the Chicago Tribune. Thomas Hartley was arrested on federal charges and eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison. His real estate empire collapsed, and his family lost their fortune and social standing. Brandon Hartley was Mark's final victim. Mark abducted the teenager from the parking lot of his private school, taking him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago. For 8 hours, the same amount of time that Ethan had been unconscious after his attack, Mark systematically tortured Brandon. He broke the boy's fingers one by one, fractured his ribs, and inflicted the same type of head injuries that Ethan had suffered. I wanted him to know exactly what my son had experienced, Mark told me, his voice devoid of emotion. I wanted him to feel every moment of pain and terror that Ethan had felt. Mark left Brandon in the warehouse, calling 911 from a payphone to report the location. Brandon survived, but like Ethan, he suffered permanent brain damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. By this point, the police had connected the attacks and were actively investigating them as a series. The fact that all three victims had been involved in Ethan's assault made Mark an obvious suspect, but proving his involvement was challenging. Mark had been careful to avoid leaving physical evidence, and he had alibis for several of the attacks. Moreover, many people in the community, while not condoning his methods, sympathized with his motivation. The investigation might have continued indefinitely if not for Mark's final mistake. In his desire to make the Hartley family suffer completely, Mark decided to target Thomas Hartley's elderly mother, who lived in a nursing home. Mark broke into the nursing home and attacked the 78-year-old woman while she slept, beating her severely before fleeing. Unlike his previous victims, Eleanor Hartley died from her injuries 3 days later. This murder crossed a line that even Mark's supporters couldn't excuse. Eleanor Hartley had nothing to do with her grandson's attack on Ethan. She was an innocent, elderly woman who became a victim of Mark's expanding thirst for revenge. The nursing home had better security cameras than Mark had realized, and the footage clearly showed his face. He was arrested the next day at his apartment, where police found evidence linking him to all of the attacks. During his arrest, Mark showed no resistance and no remorse. He confessed to everything immediately, providing detailed accounts of each attack and explaining his motivations. "I did what I had to do," Mark told the arresting officers. "Those people destroyed my son's life and thought they could get away with it. I made sure they understood that there are consequences for their actions." Mark's trial became a media sensation. The prosecution portrayed him as a dangerous vigilante who had escalated from property crimes to murder. The defense argued that Mark had been driven to temporary insanity by the trauma of watching his son nearly die and seeing his attackers escape meaningful punishment. The community was divided. Many parents, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, expressed understanding for Mark's actions, even if they couldn't condone them. They saw him as a father who had been pushed beyond his limits by a system that protected wealthy children while abandoning victims like Ethan. Others, particularly those from affluent backgrounds, viewed Mark as a dangerous criminal who had terrorized innocent families. They argued that his actions were far worse than the original assault, and that he had become the very monster he claimed to be fighting against. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Mark was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, Eleanor Hartley's death, 4 counts of attempted murder, 3 counts of arson, and numerous other charges. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, Mark showed no emotion and expressed no regret for his actions. He testified in his own defense, calmly describing each attack and explaining his reasoning. "I protected my son the only way I could," Mark said during his testimony. "The system failed him, so I became his justice." But the most devastating moment of the trial came when Ethan himself testified. Now 13 years old and still recovering from his brain injury, Ethan struggled to speak clearly as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his words slurred but his meaning clear. "I love my dad, but what he did was wrong. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of what happened to me. I wanted justice, not revenge." Ethan looked directly at his father. "Dad, I'm proud of you for taking care of me and protecting me my whole life. But I'm not proud of what you did to those families. You hurt innocent people, and that's not justice." Mark's composure finally cracked. For the first time since his arrest, he began to cry. "The worst part," Mark told me during our interview, "wasn't the life sentence or the knowledge that I'd never be free again. It was seeing the disappointment in my son's eyes. I had spent 12 years trying to be the kind of father he could be proud of, and I threw it all away for revenge." Mark learned later that Ethan had been placed in foster care after his arrest. Despite his brain injury, Ethan was making progress in his recovery and had even returned to school, though at a facility better equipped to handle students with disabilities. Ethan writes to me sometimes, Mark said, pulling out a letter from his most recent correspondence. He tells me about his therapy, his new school, his foster family. They seem like good people who genuinely care about him. Mark's voice broke as he continued. He always ends his letters the same way. I love you, Dad, but I wish you had found another way. Every time I read those words, I realize that I didn't protect my son at all. I just added to his trauma. The 3 boys who had originally attacked Ethan were also permanently affected by Mark's revenge. Tyler Blackwood never recovered emotionally from the trauma of seeing his house burn and being attacked himself. He developed severe anxiety and depression, eventually dropping out of school and struggling with substance abuse. Connor Morrison's injuries left him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. He abandoned his plans for college and became increasingly isolated from his peers. Brandon Hartley's brain injury was the most severe. Like Ethan, he suffered permanent cognitive damage that affected his memory, speech, and motor skills, the promising future that his father had described during the juvenile court proceedings was gone forever. In trying to make those boys pay for what they did to Ethan, Mark reflected, I created 4 more victims of brain injury and trauma. I became exactly the kind of person I was supposed to be protecting my son from. Mark spent his days in prison writing letters to the families of his victims, expressing remorse for his actions, and trying to find some way to make amends for the irreparable damage he had caused. I can't bring back Eleanor Hartley, Mark told me. I can't undo the trauma I inflicted on those children and their families. I can't give my son back the father he deserved. All I can do is try to understand how love turned into hatred, and how protecting my child became destroying other people's children. As our interview concluded, Mark looked at me with eyes that held depths of regret I had rarely encountered in my years of police work. Detective Johnson, he said quietly, if you ever share my story with others, I want them to understand something important. I thought I was being a good father by getting revenge for my son, but a good father would have found a way to help his child heal instead of creating more pain in the world. Mark paused, staring at the concrete walls of his cell. My son needed me to show him that there was still goodness in the world after what happened to him. Instead, I showed him that hurt people, and that love can be just as destructive as hatred. That's the real tragedy of my story, not that I'm spending the rest of my life in prison, but that I failed the person I was trying to protect. Today, Mark Collins sits in his cell, serving multiple life sentences for crimes committed in the name of fatherly love. Ethan, now 16, visits him occasionally, still struggling with the lasting effects of his brain injury but working hard to build a life focused on healing rather than revenge. The case of Mark Collins serves as a stark reminder of how quickly love can transform into obsession, protection into destruction, and justice into vengeance. It's a story that haunts everyone involved, including those of us who investigated it. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we end up hurting the most, not through malice, but through misguided attempts to protect them from a world that seems determined to cause them pain. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that explore the complex motivations behind the darkest human actions. Next week, we'll share the confession of a woman who discovered her husband's terrible secret and made a choice that would destroy both their lives forever. Until then, remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when not to act at all.